Nima, I just wanted to share some breaking news that Ryan Routh has been found guilty on all counts. We're just getting that into our Live Now from Fox studio. And we were talking, really no surprise to you, as this really was quick deliberations on, on the part of the jury. Can you talk more about the fact that the jury has reached unanimously guilty on all counts?
Well, Stephanie, you got to get 12 out of 12 beyond a reasonable doubt. It's not easy. It's the highest standard under the law. But in this particular case, there was so much evidence that it was Ruth at the scene. His DNA was on the firearm. He had burner phones. I mean, all the evidence in the days and weeks leading up to this attempt, that was all laid out for the jurors. And what did Ruth do on his side? He said that, again, he didn't pull the trigger. Again, it's not necessary to pull the trigger to be convicted of attempted murder. You just need a substantial step under the law. And everything that Ruth did was more than a substantial step. Then he argued essentially that he wasn't trespassing. Again, he wasn't charged with trespassing. He was charged with attempted murder, firearms offenses. Again, not really relevant to the case. And the last was, maybe the firearm was unable to shoot, and he did call firearms experts in his defense. He didn't testify himself. But again, I don't think that was a particularly good argument. Everything he did really pointed to that attempted murder conviction. That's why when it came on, I'm not shy about making predictions, but it was pretty clear the writing was on the wall. It was just a matter of wrapping up those closing arguments, and the jurors, we're going to return a verdict. The fact that it took 2 hours is probably a surprise. It's something that probably should have taken, just a few minutes.
So let's talk about that, because Ruth faces 5 federal charges, including attempting to assassinate a major presidential candidate, assaulting a federal officer, and multiple firearms offenses. If convicted, he could face life in prison. So let's take a look at the next phase of this, as he has been found guilty on all charges. When it comes to charges that are so severe, including trying to assassinate a presidential candidate. This happened in the state of Florida. What are the next steps when he could face life in prison?
So the next step will be his sentencing, and it will be put out a few months. That sentencing, there's going to be 3 sets of recommendations. The government, the Department of Justice, will make their recommendation. I imagine they're going to recommend something along the range of that 30 to life sentence. We saw a similar recommendation recently in the attempted assassination of Justice Kavanaugh, where the government there is recommending 30 years. That individual flew from California to the Maryland area and ended up going to Kavanaugh's home. Some Secret Service individuals were able to deflect this individual, but you could tell where the government's sort of lining up on these attempted assassination cases.
And Nima, I wanted to share this with our viewers right here. Fox News saying that the man accused of trying to assassinate President Donald Trump during his 2024 campaign has been found guilty on all counts at trial. I wanted to specifically focus on the presidential candidate. Obviously, assassinations are always, you have to take them very seriously. But when we're talking about a presidential candidate, how does that factor in to the potential sentence that Ryan Routh will receive?
Stephanie, obviously everyone's life matters, and we've been talking about Charlie Kirk on Live Now for the past couple of weeks now. But when you're talking about a presidential candidate or the president or a Supreme Court justice, those cases become federal cases because there's usually a political layer on top of the crime of violence. And obviously in this country, we can't use violence to affect, political means. So that's something that the Department of Justice takes very seriously. Secret Service takes seriously. We need to protect our elected officials. Otherwise, folks won't want to run or serve the country, right? If they're put at danger. And imagine the turmoil and the civil unrest and really what happened to our democracy, regardless of how you feel about Donald Trump or Joe Biden or anyone, if they're subject to assassination. And obviously there have been multiple attempts on the current president when he was a candidate for office. So these are important cases. We certainly can't allow this type of political violence. That's why I expect Ruth, even though he didn't pull the trigger, even though there wasn't a shot fired, for him to spend decades in federal prison. So at the sentencing, which will be a few months from now, then probation will come. They'll make their recommendation. And of course, Ruth, who's representing himself, will make his recommendation. And it's up to Judge Cannon to impose a sentence. And I expect that sentence to be swift, significant, and lengthy based on the facts of this case.
I wanted to share once again with our viewers. This is the body camera video of when law enforcement took Ryan Routh into custody. That is the suspect now found guilty on all counts. And, Nima, you were talking about that political bent. It's politically charged. And I wanted to ask you, specifically the defense was, and you were mentioning this, that Ryan Routh had never actually pulled the trigger, but that did not matter. It was the intent, his intent to assassinate then candidate President Trump. Can you talk about the importance of that and how that factors in?
So attempted murder is a specific intent crime, which means that you actually have to intend to kill your victim, and you have to take a substantial step to doing that. So acquiring a firearm, tracking the president, going to the golf course, the days and weeks leading up to this incident, but for, the outstanding work of law enforcement, frankly, and maybe the grace of God, Donald Trump is still alive right now. So that's all more than a substantial step, which is sufficient under the law for attempt. You don't actually have to squeeze that trigger. And there's plenty of cases going back, hundreds of years on this, that is enough for attempted murder. Now, Ruth was trying to make this argument that because he didn't pull the trigger, he shouldn't be charged with attempted murder, but that's just not the law. So obviously, that is the most serious count. There are some other counts as well. So when sentencing rolls around, the big factor will be that attempted murder of a presidential candidate, one of the most serious offenses under federal law, which is going to result in a very significant prison sentence. Now, I wonder what Ruth is going to argue at sentencing. There's really no mandatory minimum in a case like this, but I fully expect that Judge Eileen Cannon, who obviously was given some favorable rulings to President Trump when it came to the classified documents case, I don't think she's going to grant Ruth any leniency whatsoever.
And Nima, you bring up an interesting point because Ryan Routh is going to have a chance to speak his mind at the sentencing. We don't know what we're going to hear, and this is federal court, so cameras are not allowed inside. But who else might we expect to hear from?
I think in a case like this, the only shot Ruth has to get any sort of break whatsoever would be to put on some sort of mitigation argument. And this is certainly not a legal defense. It's not a justification for what he did. But if there are some mental health issues, if there's some sort of explanation as to how he was radicalized and why he wants to do this. Again, I'm not saying that means he's going to get a walk or a slap on the wrist, but that's really the only chance he has of maybe avoiding a life sentence in federal prison. I mean, that's something that good lawyers do in any type of case. Can be a murder case, can be an attempted murder case, or even a less serious case. Obviously here, there's no way that he's going to be able to argue that he's actually innocent or wasn't me. He doesn't really have many good arguments left on appeal. So this is really the only chance he has of potentially, just maybe not getting life in this case.
And Nima, we were sharing with our viewers, it does look like, unfortunately, this camera has now frozen, but it was a live look outside the federal courthouse. And we did see some movement right there as photographers were chasing after an individual who was running away. We don't know who that particular person was. But when it comes to, people inside the courtroom who are hearing this, potentially family members perhaps of Ryan Routh, who might be in the courtroom right now, as we're still, we haven't really seen anyone in the exterior, but who might be in that courtroom?
Obviously, like you said, there's no cameras allowed in federal court, so it's just those courtroom sketch artists. But typically, you would see family members of the defendant, especially during closing arguments and deliberations. Again, this is something that we typically see. If there is a defense attorney, jurors tend to sympathize with defendants that do have that family support. So oftentimes, in any type of criminal case. We saw it, for instance, in the Sean P. Diddy Combs case, right? The family members were there almost every day supporting the defendant. That tends to help the defense. Again, obviously here, the different type of case with Ryan Routh because he's representing himself, but that's something that you will see a lot. It's really defense lawyering 101. They want to make sure that their client is not in that orange or colored prison garb. They're in civilian clothes. The family members are there right behind them in the gallery. That tends to at least implicitly help the defense. I'm not saying jurors make decisions based on sympathy, but these are important factors that good lawyers do. So I know that Ruth had shadow counsel who was basically on standby, unable to step in if things went sideways. The concern with a self-represented defendant is that the case might become a circus, especially in a potentially political case like this. So I don't know if those lawyers were available as needed, if they were providing advice behind the scenes, but that's something that you would like if you were defending a case like this.
And I want to ask you this, Nima. Obviously, he will remain in federal custody. He's not going anywhere after being found guilty on all charges. But, what is the next step? Will he remain where he is indefinitely, or will he then be transferred to another federal prison?
He's going to be transferred to another facility. And since he's serving so much time, and since this was a crime of violence, he's going to be housed in Supermax or one of these Bureau of Prison facilities for violent criminals. I mean, at the end of the day, even though he didn't pull the trigger, this was a crime of violence. This isn't some white collar criminal. And not only may he be a danger to other inmates, he may be a danger to himself. We're seeing it in the Tyler Robinson case, for instance. Here's someone who, at least reportedly, threatened to commit suicide. So again, it's just speculation. I don't know if there are mental health issues or other things going on behind the scenes that would cause someone to do this. But given the length of the sentence, given the potential that he may harm himself or others, this is someone that the Bureau of Prisons has to place in a very specific kind of facility. This is not someone, Ruth, who can be in the general population. So when it comes to the placement of federal inmates, it's really up to the discretion of the BOP. I mean, they can house him wherever they have space and wherever they feel is safe for him and others. So I don't expect it to be in Florida. It may be anywhere in the United States.
And we're now getting a lot of reaction from elected officials. I wanted to share with our viewers this from Attorney General Pam Bondi, who has responded to this guilty verdict, saying, quote, "Today's guilty verdict against would-be Trump assassin Ryan Routh illustrates the Department of Justice's commitment to punishing those who engage in political violence. This attempted assassination was not only an attack on our president, but an affront to our very nation itself. I am grateful to the entire legal team and our law enforcement partners for protecting President Trump and securing this important verdict." And Nima, I do want to ask you, because as you were pointing out, we are in a very politically charged climate. Attorney General Pam Bondi referring to that, talking about political violence. We have been seeing political violence ramping up in the months, and her message is a very strong statement to anyone who might be considering that. What are your thoughts?
Stephanie, I haven't always agreed with Pam Bondi, but she's absolutely right here. There is an increase in political violence in this country and extremism, really on both sides, the right and the left. And regardless of how we feel about one another or our candidates or elected officials, we cannot engage in this type of violence. And it's up to federal prosecutors and state and local prosecutors to put these individuals in jail and law enforcement to prevent these types of attacks and schemes. When people are being targeted because of their political beliefs or their speech, I mean, that is very dangerous. And she's absolutely right. To assassinate a presidential candidate, it really is an attack on our democracy itself. So this was a righteous case, a good result for the Department of Justice and the U.S. Attorney's Office of the Southern District of Florida. So I tip my hat to them. Again, I did expect this result given the strength of the case and the fact that Ruth was representing himself, but still a good result nonetheless.
And we now have a new live look outside the federal courthouse, as we've been sharing with our viewers, and you've been sharing also, Nima, that no cameras are allowed inside. All we have are the sketches from the sketch artist, as well as the information that reporters are able to write down. They have to give up their electronic devices before they enter in. Can you talk about, and you know, we've discussed that, you know, just moments ago, but the fact that because of these parameters within a federal courthouse, there really isn't the circus that, you know, might come from the antics inside the courtroom, where people know that cameras are trained on them. And oftentimes, because of that, there are theatrics. You know, it becomes a performance of sorts. That has really been eliminated with the fact that there are no cameras. How does that impact, if at all, you know, the proceedings within a court, especially when it comes to a trial of this magnitude?
Well, it certainly can affect things. I mean, I've gone on record on Live Now and said I'm a big believer in cameras in the courtroom. I think the public should have access. We have a presumption of open trials in this country. So if someone wants to walk into that courtroom and watch, they should be able to. And if someone's unable, they should be able to watch it, whether it's on Live Now or some other streaming service. Now, obviously, the federal rules of criminal procedure, and I believe it's Rule 54, doesn't allow for any recording devices in federal courts. And we have to talk to Chief Justice John Roberts about that. Hopefully one day that will change. But I think in the interest of transparency, in the interest of access, and just frankly, in the interest of people understanding our criminal justice system, I would be a proponent of more cameras in the courtroom. Otherwise, we're relying on secondhand reporting. But, you know, I do agree it can bring that circus element. I mean, we've all seen the trials going back to OJ, but maybe it's more recently Johnny Depp and Amber Heard, where everyone is watching the trials live and they're trying to get information. So there are some potential drawbacks, but I do think the accessibility and the trust does weigh in favor of more access, in my humble opinion.
And we now have another vantage point as we see two individuals now walking down. We also have some breaking news that I want to share with you, as Fox News is just reporting that Routh appears to have tried to stab himself after a verdict was read in the courtroom. That's just coming in to our Live Now from Fox Studios. This is according to Fox News. You know, this is, you know, I mean, initial reaction, Nima, to the fact that he tried to stab himself apparently in the courtroom after the verdict was read.
Stephanie, again, I'm not surprised. And some of this is just speculation, but just having handled a lot of these types of cases, I put more than 1,000 people in federal prison when I was the federal prosecutor. You know, it really takes someone, you know, it's hard to get in the mind of a killer or an attempted killer, but it really takes someone with some serious issues to want to kill another human being and spend so much time planning it. Let's not forget, this isn't, you know, a spur of the moment bar fight. Again, I'm not excusing that, you know, where someone just temporarily loses it, right? This is someone who's spent significant period of time planning to assassinate another human being. Oftentimes, they do have mental health issues. Again, it's not a legal defense. We're not talking about insanity here or diminished capacity, but it can be potentially a factor in mitigation. So the fact that Ruth tried to kill himself, the fact that maybe he didn't see this coming, for me, this result was inevitable, you know, both from the beginning of the case because the evidence was so strong, but especially when he tried to represent himself. Again, typically people that are thinking rationally would avail themselves of the public defender. It's not going to cost them anything, as opposed to, you know, representing themselves and proceeding pro se. So the fact that he tried to kill himself really goes back to my earlier point. When he is in federal custody in a Bureau of Prisons, this is someone that really needs to be isolated, both because he's going to be a danger to himself and potentially others.
We're taking a live look here outside the federal courthouse in Fort Pierce, Florida. And there was some activity right here. No doubt we can see that the media is now stationed outside the front entrance, likely waiting for any sort of reaction from folks inside the courtroom right here. But we are continuing to follow breaking news at this hour. According to Fox News, Ryan Routh appears to have tried to stab himself after the verdict. The verdict is that the jury unanimously found him guilty on all counts, including trying to assassinate a presidential candidate. And Nima, you were talking about the mental state of these individuals, the fact that, he's been found guilty of trying to kill another human being, a presidential candidate. And you were saying with that mental state already as it was, this perhaps is not surprising news. But I have to imagine this now impacts, how he will, be held in federal prison. No doubt he'll be put on suicide watch. He'll be put in isolation, around the clock care, because, they need to monitor this. How does that work? What are the safety parameters as, he still awaits sentencing?
So step one, Stephanie, is isolation. We're really talking about 23 hours a day by yourself because you may be a risk to others. With respect to what he has access to, even a pen, even shoelaces, even something that mundane can be used as a weapon or a means to commit suicide. Obviously, when it comes to the BOP, they don't want another Jeffrey Epstein situation. And I understand that some people think he was murdered, but regardless of whether he was killed or, as I believe, he committed suicide, that's a real black eye for the BOP. So they don't want one of their inmates killing themselves, killing another human being. So you have to be very careful with someone like that. Obviously, they're going to receive mental health treatment while at the BOP. There'll be therapy, there'll be psychiatric meds that will be on to try to, whether it's antipsychotic or something similar, to really try to kind of lower that temperature and to even them out. Obviously, I'm not a doctor, but I just know how these types of inmates are handled, because there are people who would rather sadly kill themselves and spend the rest of their life in federal prison. So that's a real risk here, and something that prison officials need to watch out for.
Nima, you were talking about the concern over individuals using mundane objects, and we do have more breaking news details from Fox News stating that would-be Trump assassin Ryan Routh tried to stab himself in the neck with a pen after the guilty verdict was read in court. And you were mentioning these everyday objects. You brought up Jeffrey Epstein inside his jail. And truly, when you look into this, the mental state of somebody who has just been convicted on all counts, found guilty on all counts, the fact that he grabbed a pen from inside a federal courthouse to apparently try to stab himself in the neck, I mean, that just gives you perhaps more insight into his mental state right there.
Absolutely. And obviously, we're in a courtroom. There's pens, there's pencils, there's notepads. Obviously, there's U.S. Marshals there. It's a very serious case, making sure the judge and jurors are protected, anyone in the audience. But yeah, I mean, someone like this, if they're going to try to kill themselves by stabbing themselves in the neck with a pen, think how painful that would be. Think how unlikely that would be of actually having a chance of success. But that just really shows the mental state of this individual. What really happened here? Did Ryan Routh really think that those jurors were going to come back so quickly with a not guilty verdict? I mean, for me, this was a foregone conclusion, but it just really shows that this is someone who's clearly not thinking straight, that doesn't understand our criminal justice system, does not realize what the evidence and the law mean, and the fact that that jury returned a verdict so quickly. I mean, most folks who were watching said maybe we'll get a verdict tomorrow. It's getting a little bit later in the afternoon today, but quick verdict, case like this, almost always means a guilty verdict. That's why I predicted it at the beginning of the show. That's why, when it came, it was no surprise, but apparently it was a big surprise to Ryan Routh.
We appreciate you sticking with us as we continue to follow this breaking news. We will. I know that you're incredibly busy, so we appreciate your time as we continue to follow this. Thank you for joining us here on Live Now from Fox.
Of course, Stephanie, thanks for having me as always.